Thanks. All right.
Thank you, guys. So, quick rules of engagement. If you don't interrupt us, I will feel like I have failed, and then I will not sleep well at night. So, interrupt us, ask us questions. The more discussion-y this session is, I think the more we can actually derive out of it, because it's not just the fact that Justin and I only prepped about 4 hours ago exactly what we're going to say. It's not that. We've been prepping for 2 weeks. It's also just about the fact that we cannot actually guess what's top of mind for you and what we can talk about, right? So our session is called Building for Builders with Open Source, because that's what we're here for, but that's a very macro topic, and there's a lot of things that we can dive into. And I really hope that the similarities, but also the contrast between where Docker is at and where that entire ecosystem that Justin has been leading versus where Phlox is at and where Nix is at, we can kind of provide really, hopefully, good takeaways for you guys to take something home with. So that's one thing. Interrupt us, raise your hand. I'll be a moderator / host / speaker / handstander. So I'll try to call on you or at least recognize you and make some eye contact, and hoping we can have a good session. So thank you guys for being here. And kick it off, I think we can, Matt did a great introduction to both of us, but I think the most interesting part that I would love to share is how did we even get here, right? Talking about building for builders, that's a niche within a niche within a niche, right? Software engineering, or that entire space is a niche. Then you can go into deep tech, and that's a niche. But then you can say, I actually want to build for the software engineers, and that's a different space. So maybe we can kind of start off with that, Justin.
Yeah, I think in my case, it was because of open source that it happened first. Because open source really, changed the way you think about tools, because tools just became something that you could contribute to, and you could kind of dabble in tools, and you could kind of experiment and use them. But then it was also, and I think without open source being so prevalent, I think there was a time that most people are probably too young to remember when you had to buy compilers and and things like that. It was a long time ago, kind of weird, and we don't really think about that now. And then there's combined with being inquisitive and building things for yourself, and I think that there's this big advantage in building things for yourself, for people like you, is actually really enticing as a thing. People are going to pay me for building things for myself. That's kind of cool. I think it's also it can be a bit of a distraction. It can lead you away from actually thinking about the customer who's not like you as well. But I think that's how I think probably most of us have got into those especially if you're quite introspective about the way you work and thinking about how you learn, how you discover new things, and building new things is part of that journey. And I think and that openness really helps you explore that. How about you?
Yeah, couldn't agree more. So I think from my end, it was obviously I was not at the age where I was buying compilers. But I did start off my career in military, so back in Israel. And as you can probably guess, usually military-based engineering or technology are usually 20 to 30 years behind the general industry. So while I came in a bit later on, I was still copying things down to a CD or to a disk, and then running to the server room that's 3 stories underground to go and install it on a server that I couldn't find. Physically couldn't find, not actually, finding it like we can today. And I think for me, that was just, I wasn't even exposed, because that was my first step into engineering at all, in software engineering. I wasn't even exposed that you don't have to do that. So for me, the journey for building for builders was trying to get my team more productive, because I was, obviously pulling my hair out with the fact that sharing or collaborating on a file mean literally taking a file, dropping it into a shared folder in some file system, and then someone accessing that file and waiting for them to close the file. And that's for me, it was just a burning holy cow, this is not how we should be working. And then when I left, I was like, oh, okay, we shouldn't be working like that. and I think to your point, right, the fact that you're able to build for yourself is just very enticing. So I don't know if there's folks out there that are thinking about this space, either in the finishing computer science degrees or trying to spin something up or on open source projects for these realms. But I think the biggest takeaway from my end is that it's insanely fun because we have such a tight-knit community of people that care. And I think it's a bit biased because you kind of end up here because you care. On the flip side, when we are on the entrepreneurship track, the thing that I've noticed is you have to kind of keep reminding yourself that you are biased, right? You are kind of drinking from that Kool-Aid, and you do sometimes want to take a step back and look at what you're building, because when you're only, when you get into that circle of building for yourself, that's not exactly how you end up selling a product. But I don't know if you had any.
Yeah, I mean, I think as I said, like the customer isn't always like you, and I think I think as often in the beginning, the customers, in fact, or the users are exactly like you because they're the 6 people who are massively excited about this thing you're building, and it's. But I think when you have millions and millions of users like Docker, they're actually very different, and they have very different view of the world. They have a very different view of how they want to use and consume the tool, and what they understand about it. I mean, and particularly with open source, I'm like at the beginning, almost all of the users of Docker were also potential contributors. They could understand the code base, and they were Go programmers, and they kind of understood what this containerization stuff was all about, and so on. Now, like, they're all sorts of people. They're like Node.js developers and front-end developers, and like also doing ML and AI, and the last thing in their mind is contributing to the tool. So there's definitely an evolution around
I think that's
that.
a really good segue to another topic that's been on my mind, and hopefully some people in the crowd, because otherwise stop us, and we will talk about other things. And that's how things don't stay the same, right? Especially when we're talking about the topic of building for builders with open source, there's a level of complexity that is not there when you're building closed source software, right? When you're building closed source, you're kind of getting it together, you're building it, you're releasing it to customers, and you're iterating. Here, there is a community aspect, right? So I think the question here is, how can open source companies, or people thinking about building companies on top of open source, kind of think about the evolution of the company, but also of the community that comes with it?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's funny looking here because Phil just walked in, and like Phil was one of our early contributors to Docker, and
thank you, Phil.
And Adrian's here. Like, there's a lot of people from the Docker community, and like it's fascinating to see how they've gone into even the people have gone into very different roles. They're very senior now, and Phil's at AWS now, and like a lot of the people's journey is actually like related to how they latched onto an ecosystem and contributed as well. And I think we all kind of grow up through these ecosystems, and they change us, and they change the way we think about problems as well.
Yeah, I would agree. I think from my end, the way I'm perceiving it, right, again, Phlox and Nix, while Justin will, I like positioning Nix as like we're the up and coming. We were only around for a few years now. Nix has been around for 20 plus years.
Twice as old as Docker.
But we're cool.
Can we speak about the journey to make it profitable and the challenge that you face?
So can you repeat that?
If you could speak about the journey to make it profitable, to make it happen with the solution, and the challenge that you face.
Yeah, definitely. I will finish the thought, and then we can also grab into that. Yeah, so the question was more about the journey, right? Going from, we're going to build this thing, and we're all really excited, and we're a group of 5, or 2, or 3, or whatever. There's no magic number. And then how does that grow into actually monetizing and sustainability, right? So I think super critical. I'll just wrap up on at least from my end, on the community growth and company growth. I think for folks out there and for us, right, we've seen that things change. And you can't always assume it's going to be the same. And the more that you can proactively be thoughtful about that, the better, because the one thing you do want is to keep, I guess, at least from my end, the community spirit alive, or the meaning of open source alive within your projects, right? So it's obvious that as more commercialization enters and money enters the mix, it changes. It changes from the early time of we're a group of a few engineers that are hacking and super excited about this, to suddenly there's a big community like you were mentioning, and the different aspects coming into it. Before we move on to the next topic, but is there like a top of mind for you as for people going into it or thinking about it?
I mean, I think you've got to be conscious about your relationship with the community, what's in the community space, how you're going to work with them, what the kind of contract is with your community, and it's very important to kind of be thoughtful about that, not change it too much, there's lots of different kind of aspects to that. At Docker, we always had the philosophy of like open source projects and then commercial products, and there was like, and we that was the distinction we had. And if you want a product, then that's commercial. If you want a open source project and you're hacking and stuff, but there are different approaches to that. But I think that having a line, making it clear, explaining it, making people understand what each one's for, what the scope is, what you can do is really important, so that so that your community don't get confused. And there's lots of examples where people really, like HashiCorp recently, just changing the contract on the community without unexpectedly, really kind of changes that relationship drastically.
Yeah, I would also say that a big part for us and like Nix and Phlox and those communities is that the way I perceive, right, the relationship, or at least how to maintain it, at least at the low, the highest level, is the community in my mind always needs to stay a greenfield of innovation. And that should be the leading thought whenever we make decisions or changes or whatever it is, and as we grow, right? The community needs to stay a place where newcomers are super welcomed. Folks with edge ideas about, for us, like I just came from FOSDEM, there was someone who was talking about Nix and genetics, right? The guy doing, or the gal doing Nix and genetics can come in, be welcomed by the community and improve the community. And then the commercial, right, orientation of it should always be on top and not competing with what the community itself at the core is trying to do. Licensing obviously comes big into it, but I think I do want to address the question, because I did want this to be as conversational as possible. So just to repeat, the question that was asked was about growing from that hacky team into sustainability. What does that mean? I think that's also a macro topic, because there's so much underneath it. It's not just about company sustainability. I think it's also about community sustainability, because I think we've seen also many times where a company could be successful very fast, the community dies away and loses a lot of the heart. So I'd love to tackle that. Is there other finding points or niche points around that topic that people are interested in? Yeah.
So I think one of the things that's interesting to me that I'd be interested to hear your viewpoints on is, particularly when you've got a long-running kind of open source project, if you look at the sort of the trajectory of the container world since Docker started, right, that you're kind of somewhat open to the effects of other projects that have happened throughout that time, and I'm interested in how you think about navigating that. I'm thinking in terms of, Docker's kind of gone through the Mesos era, through the Kubernetes era. You've got all these other things, these other actors that are in fact nothing to do with, they have huge impacts potentially on the commercial activities of a particular company around that project.
So I'm gonna probably butcher the question, but just repeat it on the microphone. It's good.
I didn't really get to the actual question, but
I might have understood it. If I didn't, correct me. So what I'm hearing is, on the path to monetization or sustainability, or whatever is that end goal for us, there are market shifts that happen either because of market impact, other players, new technologies. Right? We are in the tech space, so tomorrow morning could be some new principle that shifts. And how does that impact, or how do we think about and strategize along the journey for it? So I appreciate that addition to it. How are you thinking about it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, there's, I mean, I think the container ecosystem and the cloud native ecosystem is a really interesting example because it just, there was so much interest, so many things to do in those early days, and as you say, there were quite a lot of different ways of thinking about things. I mean, Kubernetes, wasn't the first kind of orchestrator, but it became hugely successful. I think for a long time at Docker, we were a little bit confused about what the relationship should be, and it was, I mean, there was the famous meeting, which I was not in, where Google offered Kubernetes to Docker to sit in their GitHub org and said, "Would you like this?" And we said no.
I haven't seen pictures yet of Justin not being in that meeting.
But it's like, and it took quite a long time. It took quite a long time internally to kind of move Docker towards a kind of Kubernetes ecosystem. I think it could have been a very different way. So I think these kinds of things are always points at which you've got to examine, like, what's important for the company, what's important for the ecosystem, what's changed, what you're going to do, what other people are going to do. And I think there was a period around that time, I think, which was a mistake, where Docker became very inward-looking, and it took a lot of internal convincing work to persuade people that Kubernetes was actually a good thing and we should embrace it, which we did, but it took a lot of time, and there were some people who were like, well, "What's this terrible thing that we shouldn't do that?" And so it kind of took a while to come around to that, and I think that it could have been a very different story. But I think there's always that kind of thing, like when things are very fast moving and there's so much innovation, like what's the ephemeral stuff and what's the real stuff and why, and what's going to win, and what are the politics becomes, there's a lot of politics and companies trying to, muscle in. I mean, Docker was a little upstart with these giant companies like Red Hat and VMware who felt they had a kind of position in the ecosystem. So it was difficult to navigate, and we definitely made a lot of mistakes around that, understanding that transition. But I think you have to be open and understand what people are trying to do. I think really early on, I remember going to one of the really early Kubernetes meetups, and people were writing deployment scripts in Kubernetes. That was the first thing people did, and that's where kind of GitOps and things came from. Was deployment was what the first use case, and you couldn't do that with Docker Swarm because the security model didn't allow it. And it was like, okay, this is what the customers and the users want to do. They can't do that with our thing. This is a problem. Understanding those kind of what the use cases are that are driving the adoption is really important.
So that's interesting that you were saying there that I think I'm understanding what you're saying is that you can actually you got those insights into your own users from participating in the community that was actually, off to one side of what you guys were actually doing at the time.
Right? Yeah, definitely. And I think, it's really important to stay in touch with where people are and not just think about what you're shipping. You've got to be open-minded and
well, as you know, it was a mesosphere where some people probably didn't, keep enough of a view to that side.
I do also want to kind of roll back to the growing into the sustainability piece, because I think it's also a critical one. I can speak to at least our purview, right? We're kind of on the left, even though Nix has been around. We're kind of on the left of that journey to sustainability and full monetization. And from my perspective to it, I think it's really highly situational. So whatever we're going to say here is not like that square block that fits into the square block shape for open source communities. There's so many different models that can work, and you got to figure it out based on the community, the technology, what the users want. For us, at the end of the day, I think it was first establishing what is it that we're trying to do over the next few years. And I think one of the pieces that landed us as a core principle is, for us, Nix changes a few core principles in software engineering. And therefore, we knew that we wanted to assist in growing that perception of the principles, because that will be a driving function to any sustainability or monetization that would come to the right of it. And therefore, for Phlox, very factually, one of the things that we're doing and have been doing over the last, since we've started, is focusing on growing the adoptability of the Nix concepts by releasing open source software that is not necessarily paid for, it's free, right? But allows more people to come in and understand what we're trying to do. So for us, it's kind of like a building block, right? Kind of like a ladder, where we hope that by establishing the first rung, we can then bring people up to the second one, where we'll introduce them to more enterprise functionality. But that's an example of a monetization plan, and I'm sure Justin has the other end of it.
I think that, like, the first time we tried to monetize, we actually did something really stupid, which we tried to sell people who were not using Docker, and they were like, our core early users all really were deep into the cloud, because this whole cloud native thing, cloud, Docker, they were like interlinked. We were trying to sell an on-prem product to people who hadn't adopted Docker, were not using that, and it just kind of was really hard. It was a very difficult thing. We're trying to tell people what it was. Second time around, when we relaunched Docker, we really focused on just like where the users were, where the love was, where the community was, like monetizing actual existing usage that had come from kind of naturally out of adoption, and it was a very different route. So we were not trying to and really not trying to. The whole point of kind of building, the whole point of open source is to actually leverage that the usage and community and growth that's already there, and the people who are already using your product, and trying to find things that provide business and other needs on top of that, but like start where the usage actually is. And we didn't really fail to do that the first time around. It really didn't work.
Yeah, I think that's also, for me at least, Docker is definitely a story that we were heavily relying on and learning from. So I think the fact that Docker also has been super transparent about the journey, and again, we're talking about entrepreneurship, is game-changing for a lot of other founders and folks, right, building in open source. So I think that's super helpful. We do have like a final topic that we would be happy to touch in the last 5 minutes, but unless there's another question from the audience, so it's up to you. The last topic is collaboration in the open source space between open source companies, but happy to hear out if there's anything else that folks wanted to touch. Yeah.
Yeah, so you spoke a bit about at the beginning about the joy of building for yourself as someone building a DevTools company. So I'm just curious how you think about prioritizing features between those requested by your customers and those that your engineers want. Obviously, in a traditional company, you have this clear distinction between we're building this because it's cool technology and we're building this because we need to close a sale. But so I work at a small DevTools startup now, and this is one of the key challenges. So just curious to hear how you think about that.
Yeah, I think that it's in the medium term, it's never a good idea to build things to close sales anyway, because you end up with a kind of incoherent product and the things to close a sale are not necessarily the things the customers actually use. So I think there's always a thing about that. But I think that you do have to understand it's not all about your own itch, and not everyone's like you. And it soon becomes obvious that there are different kinds of users who have different requirements, different depths of use of the product, different things they find easy and difficult, and things like that. And so you do have to, I think that if you look at kind of pure open source projects that are not businesses, often they very much focus on just catering to the needs of people. Like there's a classic thing about like user experience is not, tends not to be great, but the structurally and intellectually the projects often make a lot of sense. And I think the structural and intellectual thing is actually I actually think it's important. I mean, I think that's why people like Nix, because it makes sense when you understand it. But there are also people who give up on Nix because it's hard, and it's like they want to love it, and then they try it and they think this is terrible, and like there's kind of,
if it was easy, Flux wouldn't exist.
Yeah, but that's yeah, exactly. And so there's this kind of, that you have to be able to also understand users who are at a different stage of the journey from you, and not just build for people who understand it as deeply as you do. And that kind of empathy, is something that you have to work on and think about.
Yeah, I would say the one thing, we're cursed by a lot of things, especially if we're insane enough to want to build in our own things. And then you're saying, I want to be an entrepreneur, you want to build a startup or be part of a startup. You're already, on in the chat group of insane people. And then you go a level deeper and you're like, I want to build for builders, I want to build for developers. And then you also say that you want to do open source. So what ends up happening is that you organically are in probably the smartest, and I'm obviously biased, so I'm all tapping ourselves on the shoulders here, but the smartest core group of engineers or whatnot going around and building these things. And then you have the concept of, strong opinions, strongly held. I'm sure everyone recognizes that. We're not building a dating app that we swipe left on or swipe right on. What's the right direction? We're building how people should be packaging things and how, the universe works. And I think one of the, you asked the question of, wait a second, what about what our engineers want to build versus what we think our users want? Now, the thing is that, at least from my experience, is that in most companies, right, the internal engineering org is being an ex-engineer, we would always say, like, we're way smarter. We know what the customers want. We know what we want as an engineer. And it's an even stronger opinion within the open source realms, I would say. So I think for us, it's a lot about working backwards from what are we even trying to achieve, right? That's the first thing. If it's technical superiority, hell yeah. I'm sure that the internal engineers know exactly what to build and how to build it. And the biggest saying that I've used in the first 6 months of the company was, I asked us to make a toaster that warms up bread, and we built a nuclear reactor that warms the bread of the entire city. So ideally working backwards, right, you'd be able to define what's the general company goal, if it's monetization, closing deals, if it's getting adoption or whatever it might, or even getting contributors. And you kind of want to be able to, balance it out with ideas from engineering, but not, ideas are kind of cheap. Listen to the users, listen to the target user, and the key point here is the amount of conviction or confidence you have that that's your target user. Because otherwise, then you're kind of going in the wrong direction.
Yeah, I mean, I think feedback that you get in GitHub pull requests is very different from the feedback you get from people, who is stuck inside a company trying to achieve something. Like they're just it's just a different kind of, it's a different audience, a different feedback.
Do you have two groups of engineers, one who focuses on enterprise paper features versus one who works on open source?
It's good. It's interesting. I mean, I think that it can.
So just to repeat the question,
Yeah.
Matt was asking if we have two groups of engineers, one that focuses on the open source and one that focuses on the enterprise.
I think that.
And by the way, we do need to wrap up, so
Yeah.
we'll take that as the last question, and then.
I think you need people who do both. But I mean, often it does end up like that way. I think it can end up too much like that. I mean, again, Docker, when it was in its least successful phase, a long time, literally had the company divided in half like that, and it was not great. And there was a huge amount of duplication and things like that between the two groups. I think you have to, you have to try and cross over. There always tend to be people who, I mean, we were talking about this before. Like, there are people who focus on like the open source customer interactions versus the other customer interactions, but you need to have this relationship between them and coherence across the two.
And the last thing I would say is I also know this about Docker is that even as a huge, quite larger company than we are, Docker has like Docker Labs that allows more freedom in terms of exploration in that realm. And we have Phlox Labs, and it's obviously smaller, but it kind of is kind of a escape to be able to build those things and ideate around them, but not defocus the entire team. So we're going to wrap up. This felt much shorter than 30 minutes. We're around, always happy to talk about it. Thanks everyone for joining. Thank you, Justin.
Thank you.